Hey everybody, welcome to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com and here on my YouTube channel. And in this video, we are going to try to tackle the one thing that I get asked about all the time, and that is how do I reduce or fix any latency issues in Studio One, along with any crackles, pops, and audio artifacts that I'm getting. I get this question all the time. Now, I've already had a video that I did about a year ago that you can search in the archive here on Home Recording Made Easy, and I gave you some of the basic stuff. And most times that works for most people, but there's also a bunch of other new things that I've learned, little tips and tricks that were not part of that video at the time of that recording that I want to add here. And I want to try to compile everything into this one video. So I'm going to give you 15 different things that you can look at and try to reduce latency and the audio artifacts where you're getting crackles and pops in Studio One. And this will also work for some other DAWs as well, but we're going to focus on Studio One. But a lot of these principles will apply to any DAW that you're using. Now, after you've watched these things, if you're still having a problem, there is a link in the description box below to go out to the PreSonus user community, their user forum. You can post your question and your problem there. There's a lot of great people there that can help you, as I don't know everything about Studio One. Okay, so if you're writing me an email and I referred you to this video link and you're watching this video, if these things don't help you, don't write back to me. As much as I love to hear from you, go out to the PreSonus community. Link will be in the description box below. You can also put in a support ticket with PreSonus Tech Support. The link will be in the description box below, and it'll resolve your problem that way. So when people write in, I'm going to refer them to this video. If you stumbled upon this video on YouTube before contacting me, again, try these things. Hopefully they can help you. So here we are in Studio One, and I'm going to start with, we're going to try to go through these fairly quick. So the very first tip I have for you, and I got some notes here, is the very first tip I have is, if at all possible, if you can dedicate your computer, whether it's Mac or PC, that you're using to do your studio work and your recording, your mixing and your mastering, try to dedicate a computer to your studio. Meaning, a lot of times if you're using a computer that might be a general purpose computer for household stuff where you do internet and emails and working on Excel and business plans and doing a whole bunch of other stuff, and recording is also part of what you do on that computer, that is probably not the best practice in the world, although it can work. So step one, I want to try to give this to you as the very first tip. If at all possible, try to use that computer that you're using just for your studio work and try to keep it as clean as possible, keep as the fewest apps on that computer as humanly possible, and try not to load it down with a bunch of junk on the hard drive, because that will definitely help you. Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two, and we're going to go ahead and we're here in Studio One, we're going to check our block size and our buffer settings. So on a Mac, if you come up to the Studio One menu, and you click on Preferences. Now on Windows, you're going to look at the options. There's going to be an options menu, and then you're going to go down the preferences, okay? Windows and Mac, Studio One is slightly different in a few of the features. I don't own a PC, but I know some of the shortcuts. I'm going to try to communicate that to you, but we're doing this on a Mac. So if you're on a Mac, come over here to Preferences. Okay, you're going to go to the Audio Setup tab, and underneath here you're going to see your device block size. Now if you're on a Mac, depending on your audio interface, you're going to go ahead and click that drop down arrow, and I'm going to give you a couple of rules of thumb. Now this was in my first video that I did about a year ago. When you're in the recording stage, you want to try to set this number from somewhere around 64 samples, 128, maybe even 32 samples. You want to set this as high as possible to where your latency and or your audio artifact problem goes away. So I would start with, like, say 256 samples. If you're recording now, try to record something, and if you hear latency in your headphones, and for you that don't know what latency is, let's say you plug an acoustic guitar into your audio interface or a vocal mic, you're listening on your headphones, you strum that guitar or speak into the vocal mic, and you hear kind of an echo and a delay from the time that you use the microphone. The audio travels through your interface, through Studio One, back out through your headphones. You'll get a little bit of a delay or an echo. That delay or echo is called latency, okay? And that's almost impossible to record when you have latency going on in your headphones. So you want to start with around, say, 256, see if you have any latency. If you do, lower it to 128. See if you have any latency. If you do, continue to lower it as low as you possibly can go till the latency goes away. Okay, that's for recording, okay? When you are mixing, the general rule of thumb is to start around that 256 mark. If you're loading up a bunch of plugins into your system as you're mixing and you're starting to hear that the audio cracks and pops intermittently as you're playing back your audio, come check your device block size, okay? At 256, the more plugins that you put onto your system, the more intensity is going to be on your CPU, and we'll talk about computer specs in a second. This device block size, by raising the device block size higher, it'll free up the CPU so it has more resources to go ahead and process through your plugins, okay? So start at the 256 mark if you're mixing. If you're having problems with pops and cracks and all those audio artifacts, go to 512. If you're still having a problem, raise it as high as it possibly can go, and this will all depend on your audio interface until the problem goes away. Okay, so that's usually, this in and of itself is going to usually solve 75% of the problems when it comes to latency and audio artifacts for the mixing stage. So that's why I want to tell you this first. Okay, the other thing that you can try is you're on the audio device tab here. If you go to the processing tab, you can also check your dropout protection, again, for when you're recording. I have it set to medium as defaulted, but you can also, set it to high. And if you set it to high, you'll see that the low latency times change. So on the high setting, it's 22.5 milliseconds is the low latency. 76 milliseconds for standard. If I go up to maximum, you'll see that it starts to change. You want to play with this a little bit. Now this, again, has everything to do with your computer and your system. And again, we'll talk about specs in a second, but you can start off with a medium dropout protection. Okay, this won't allow me to change it. The process block size is 512. That's kind of defaulted there. Your number may look a little bit different, but if you play around with dropout protection and your device block size on a Mac, that will help you. Okay, so that is the other thing that you can do. That's tip number 2. Okay, so let's close this. Now, tip number 3 is if you're working on a PC, you may not be able to change your device block size as I just showed you. You're going to do that in the Universal Control app if you're using Studio One. So I open up Universal Control. If you're using a PreSonus interface, you will see your PreSonus interface listed here. Now I'm not using the i2, I'm using a Universal Audio Apollo. So you don't see a device block size here, but on a PC you will see it. So let's say you're using an Audio Box USB or a Studio 192 or a Quantum or one of the PreSonus or even a Studio Live mixer. You will see a device block size here if you're on a PC. Okay, so PC, you're going to change the device block size in Universal Control, and on a Mac, you're going to change it from the preferences screen that we just looked at. Okay, so make sure that you check that, as well as I said, the dropout protection settings. Okay, those are the 2 things you can check. Now, the next tip, which will be tip number 5, is make sure that that your Universal Control app, this app is updated, that you have the latest firmware, you have the latest version, okay? That is super important. A lot of times, I don't know, every so many months, they'll have updates for Universal Control. Make sure that that is updated, especially if you're running a PC. If you're running a Mac, maybe not so much, but it's always a good practice to make sure that's updated. I've had audio artifacts, cracks, and pops happen before, and when I updated Universal Control, those problems went away. So that's always a good practice. That's tip number 5. Tip number 6, if you're not running a PreSonus interface, and let's say you're running like a Universal Audio Apollo or a Focusrite or a Motu or a Fireface or one of those other audio interfaces, if your audio interface has a piece of software similar to Universal Control, and on Universal Apollo it has their console software, okay, you want to make sure that has the latest update, and you want to make sure that it's at its current form as well. Okay, so just like with Universal Control, if you have another application that runs with your particular audio interface, make sure that interface software is updated to its latest version. And also, if there's any kind of buffer settings or block size settings for your piece of software unique to your interface, make sure you play around with those as well, just like we did in Studio One in the preferences screen. That's something that you can definitely check, and that will typically be under something like the settings screen. And again, every audio interface is going to be a little bit different, but if you click on your settings and you start clicking through some of the different screens, you may find where you have where you have a device block size or a buffer setting of some kind. And again, use the same principle. For mixing, you can set that a little bit higher. For recording, you can set it a little bit lower. On the Universal Audio Apollo, they have an input delay compensation here where you can go ahead and you can change that as well. So every audio interface is different. I don't have all the audio interfaces, so I can't give you specifics about yours, but just be aware that if you're using something other than a PreSonus interface, if you have a piece of software with it, you want to make sure it's updated and you want to see if there's any kind of buffer size or device block size, something like that, that you can make sure that that is set and kind of matches what you have in Studio One. That'll help you as well. So that was tip number 6. Tip number 7 is, again, kind of an obvious one. If you're running Studio One, make sure you have the latest version. It's whatever version of Studio One you're running, make sure you have all the updates available and installed, okay? So whether you're running version 2, version 3, version 4, version 4.5, make sure you have the latest updates. If you're having some problems, you can check that by going to the start screen in Studio One. And as you can see, a new version just came out, and I haven't installed this yet because I wanted to show this to you. You'll find your updates will be right at the top of the screen. You can also check for updates by clicking at the bottom of the screen here, this little link that says check for updates. Same thing if you're running Pro Tools, Cubase, Logic. Make sure that you have the latest and all the firmware updates that come along with it, okay? So just like with your audio interface, you want to make sure your DAW is fully updated. It doesn't mean if you're running version 2 or version 2.5 in Studio One that you have to upgrade to version 4 or 4.5, although I highly recommend it. You don't have to do that, but make sure in the version that you're using, 2, 3, or 4, that you have all the updates for that particular version. Okay, so that's tip number 7. Tip number 8, again, this will be more, I think, for maybe a PC. Let me see here. I'm going to go over to our preferences again, and we're going to go to our audio setup tab. We're going to go to song setup. On a PC, you should see, if you're using a PreSonus interface, you will see an option here, because I'm not using a PreSonus interface, a way to check off a low latency monitoring. So depending on your interface and the version of Studio One that you're running, you can do a quick Google search, check the low latency function in Studio One, especially on a PC. You'll see it down here in the master bus. You should see the little Z here. See the little Z at the bottom here of my master fader? I'll try to zoom in on it. If I click that little Z, it turns green. That's low latency monitoring, okay? And what that's going to do, again, if you're recording, that's going to help you with the latency, okay? So make sure you enable low latency monitoring. And again, you can do a YouTube search on that specifically. I don't use that in my particular setup. I don't need it, but I wanted to mention it to you, especially if you have the latency problem. The audio clicks and pops, maybe not so much, but for latency issues, make sure you have low latency monitoring enabled in your version of Studio One. That's tip number 8. Now, tip number 9, let's talk about your computer specs a little bit, which we could have talked about a little bit earlier, but forget what they say on this on the PreSonus website or the Cubase website or all these DAW manufacturers' website, where most of them will say you only need to have a minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM and you only need to have a dual core processor. That's true where you could get Studio One and your DAW to function. But most people that have these kinds of problems with the audio artifacts, the clicks and the pops and such, is because they're usually trying to run way too many plugins, way too many virtual instruments, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's because your computer isn't powerful enough to handle it. So here's what I tell all my students as far as what your computer specs really should be. And this goes for Mac and PC. You want to have a minimum of a quad core processor, in my opinion, okay? And you want to have a minimum of 16 gigabytes of RAM. And again, this is if you're kind of dedicating your computer to your studio. If you're using kind of an all-purpose computer where you use your computer for many other things, you may even want a little higher spec than that. But you want to have a quad core at the very minimum, 16 gigs of RAM. Now, if you have a computer, Mac or PC, that's, less, maybe the last 2 or 3 years old, you should be perfectly fine. Most computers that you purchase over the last few years, even entry-level computers will typically have those kinds of specs. If you're in the market for a new computer, which we'll talk about at the end of this list, if you try all these things and nothing seems to help, you're going to be in the market for a new computer, and we'll talk a little bit about what you ought to try to do when shopping for a new computer as far as how do you want to spec it out. But at the very minimum, if you don't have 16 gigs of RAM and you're not running at least a quad-core processor, a lot of these things on this list that you're going to try may still have a problem, and then we'll talk about what you should look for in a new computer. But check your specs, quad-core, 16 gigs of RAM. That's tip number 9. Tip number 10, if you're running a PC, make sure, again, all your window updates are updated and installed. Again, and depending on when you're watching this video, I think right now we're on Windows 10, but you might be running Windows 7. Make sure you have all your updates installed, okay? Make sure, just like with your DAW, just like with Universal Control, make sure all the Windows updates are installed properly. It doesn't mean you need to upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10 or Windows 10 to whatever's coming next down the road, but just make sure whatever operating system that you're using, that you have all those updates. Now on a Mac, it's not as important, okay? As long as you're not running an operating system that's more than, say, 3 or 4 revisions back, you should be okay. At the recording of this video, I'm running a Mojave, and this is, we're in the middle part of 2019. But you can run, Mavericks, you can run anything from El Capi 10 forward, and you should be just fine. But Mac changes their operating system about every 8 months to a year, so you don't have to have the latest and greatest OS. As a matter of fact, with a Mac, coming from experience, I will tell you that when they release their brand new operating system, I would not upgrade it right away unless you're about to buy a new computer what already has pre-installed. I would stay on the revision of the operating system you have. Let the new operating system for Mac be out 3 or 4 months and make sure that all these DAW programs are compatible with it. So that's something about a Mac you got to be aware of. Even though when the new operating system for the Mac hits the public, usually during the beta stage, a lot of these DAW companies are working behind the scenes to make sure that their products work with the new system that hasn't even been released yet, the new operating system. But I always tell everyone, when Mac drops a new OS, don't go out and update it right away. Sometimes you'll have no problems. Sometimes you'll have nothing but problems. And then everybody blames, PreSonus or the DAW manufacturer. It's not the DAW manufacturer. If you don't need to update your operating system, if you're on a Mac and everything is running beautifully, don't update it, at least for 3 to 6 months after it's been released, okay? So that is a tip for you. So that was tip number 10. Tip number 11, if you're running any kind of antivirus software in the background, especially on a PC like Norton Antivirus or any one of those, disable that while you're trying to record and or do your mixing. Okay, sometimes you won't have a problem, but again, depending on the configuration of your machine, what version of the operating system you're running, whether you're running a Mac or PC, what kind of antivirus you're running, that can sometimes have a conflict, okay? I see that more with PC users than Mac, but if you have antivirus for Mac, disable the antivirus. You don't need it while you're recording or mixing, and sometimes that will have a conflict. That was tip number 11. Let's flip the page here. Let's get to tip number 12. So tip number 12, if you're running a session like I am here and you're having a bunch of plugins in your session and you're having, some problems that things are just starting to crop up where they never became a problem before. Again, when we talk about audio pops and clicks and those audio artifacts, before you go crazy, the first thing I tell people is close this particular song session, reboot Studio One, okay, or any DAW that you're using, open up a brand new song file, okay? Add a few plugins, add a few audio files, and see if the problem exists. We want to try to isolate to see, is it the particular session that you're working on, where maybe you have a corrupt plugin or such, which we'll talk about in a couple of seconds, or is it something inherent with your computer that's causing the problem, okay? Because it could just be, could be a corrupt file or a corrupt plugin or something like that. So always back out of that session, save your work, shut it down, reboot it. If you're still having a problem in the current session you're working in, close that out and start a brand new song file, and just go ahead and add, maybe 5 or 6 tracks and bring some audio files in as kind of a mock-up, kind of a test session, and drop a few of your plugins on there and just see, does the problem come back? Do you have it in every song session file? Okay, and I would do it when you're adding plugins, maybe one at a time. Add a plugin, play back your audio. Is the problem there? No? Add another plugin. Try it again and see if you can kind of, through process of elimination, find out where the problem is, okay? So that's something that'll probably save you a lot of time to try to narrow in on where the problem is. Tip number 13, review all the plugins and VST instruments. Do you have any new plugins that are being used that all of a sudden you have some new plugins and now this problem exists? Or are you downloading free plugins and using them and now this problem exists? A lot of times, a lot of students of mine, they love downloading free plugins from different plugin manufacturers, and sometimes those plugins don't play nice with Studio One. I've had that problem before myself and drove me crazy for weeks, and come to find out it was some fly-by-night plugin that I used on one track. It caused me all kinds of problems. I really kind of tell people, although I'm sure there are some companies out there that make some great free plugins, I kind of stay away from those plugins because I've had nothing but problems with them, but that's not to say that you will have problems with them. But again, think about that. If you're using free plugins or some brand new plugins you just purchased from a company and installed, take those out of your session. See if the problem still exists. See if you can narrow it down to a plugin. The other, same thing with virtual instruments, whether you're using third-party virtual instruments. If you're using these ones that come standard with your DAW, you shouldn't have a problem, but think about virtual instruments as well, especially if you're working with a lot of MIDI and virtual, MIDI control keyboards and those sorts of things. Okay, tip number 14 is how many plugins are you using in your session? Okay, again, based on the specs of your computer, the more high power of a computer you have, the more plugins and VSTs that you can run simultaneously without having any of those audio artifacts. Now, it's a balance between the specs of your computer, right? We talked about quad core, 16 gigs of RAM minimum, but if you have a faster processor and more RAM, that's even more ideal. And then you can balance the specs of your computer with your buffer size and your block size that we talked about in tip number 1, tip number 2. Okay, it's kind of a balancing act. Okay, so if you have kind of a mid-range computer where you have a quad core processor, you have 16 gigs of RAM, your computer's 3 or 4 years old, okay, you can use the device block size or the buffer settings, whether it be through universal control if you're on a PC or on a Mac through the preferences window, and that'll usually solve some of your problems. But if you're trying to run a very large session with say 50, 60, 75 plugins in there, depending on the plugins and the manufacturers that they are. If they're third-party manufacturers and you're using lots of plugins, those plugins can take up a lot of CPU resources. But really the killer for this is not so much the plugins, EQ, compressors, and channel strips. It's usually the virtual instruments. A lot of times I'll get students that'll send me a session or a screenshot of their session like I'm showing you here. Right now I have no plugins on this session. And they'll say they're having all kinds of problems when they play back their audio. They're getting crackles and pops. And I'll look at their session, it'll have 12 different tracks with 12 different virtual instruments in there. Well, even on a real high-end computer, that can cause a problem. Those virtual instruments take up an enormous amount of CPU resources. Now, going back a step and saying, well, should I update my DAW? In this case, if I'm Studio One, do I update to version 4.5? I'm running version 3. Well, if you use a lot of virtual instruments, especially the ones in that come standard with Studio One, one of the major improvements they made in version 4.5 was they really made the virtual instruments a lot more efficient, meaning you can run a lot more instances of them and not have it really hit your CPU very hard, and therefore not have some of these problems with audio artifacts, clicks, and pops. Okay, so that's one motivation. If you're someone who uses lots of virtual instruments, get the latest version of Studio One. If you're on version 3, upgrade to version 4. It's a paid upgrade, but it's really affordable. If you're on version 4 already, to go to 4.5 is a free upgrade. Upgrade to the latest one, because you'll find that the virtual instruments run much more efficiently, even third-party VSTs. But VSTs is usually one of the main problems that people don't realize. You can't put 25 VSTs in your session and expect to not have some audio artifacts. Now you may say, well, my production, I use all virtual instruments, Dave. I need to record with them and I need them. What am I going to do? Well, one thing that you can do is if you have a virtual instrument, let's say on a bass, and you're using a MIDI controller and you have a virtual instrument and you record your bass parts with your keyboard, what you then can do is you can go ahead and you can consolidate that performance down to an audio track and remove the virtual instrument. And the way you do that in Studio One is with a command called transform. And if you're on a Mac, I think you come up to track, you come down to the transform, and because I'm not using any MIDI right now, it's all grayed out, but you can transform to rendered audio, okay? So if I was using a virtual instrument, okay, I can take that MIDI performance, I can transform it to an audio track, and in that process, it'll allow me to remove the virtual instrument from the track once it's been transformed, okay? Then that way I freed up my resources. There's also a way when you transform to audio where you can leave the virtual instrument on in the background. So if you want to go back and change the performance a little bit, you can. So that's one thing that you can do. If you're not using Studio One and Cubase and Pro Tools, there's a way, and I don't remember the exact terminology because it's been a while since I've used those DAWs, but do some research. There is a way to take your MIDI track that you did your performance on, convert it to audio, and then get rid of the virtual instrument out of the session. That will free up some computer resources. So that's a huge one. So pay attention to the plugins that you're using, how many you're using, and especially how many virtual instruments that you're using. Okay, so that was, let's see, tip number 14 now. Tip number 15, another mistake I see a lot of people make, and again, this really has to do a lot with, well, both latency and audio artifacts, is that they've already recorded a bunch of tracks, okay? They're mixed a bunch of their tracks, and they got a lot of plugins and a lot of processing, and they're in the mixing stage, and then they say, you know, I want to go back and I want to add another background vocal track, and they try to go back and record a new track into their session where they already got a ton of processing and plugins on them. Now, again, depending on the size of your session, depending on your computer specs, you go to do that recording and you're going to have a ton of latency. Okay, so you want to try to avoid that scenario if at all possible. If you have no choice but to go back and to add some additional tracks, the one thing you can do is you can keep all your plugins in your session. You can turn them all off to the off state. That will free up some resources. Okay, then you can go ahead and you can change, as we talked about a little earlier, you can change your device block size. If you're at the mixing stage, right, you're going to be up here around 512, maybe 1024, depending on your interface. But now you want to record, so you may have to go back and lower it to 16 or 32 samples. Shut your plugins off, record that extra background vocal, and then when you get back to mixing, you can raise your buffer, your device block size again, and you should be good to go. But that may not always work. You may still never get rid of that latency depending on, again, your computer and your session. So my advice or my tip is, before you start mixing and put a ton of plugins on tracks that are already been recorded, think about getting all of your tracks recorded. Try to get done with the recording phase before you start processing and using plugins in your session, because to go back could be a challenge. Okay, so that is tip number 15. Okay, so those are our 15 tips. Again, you can, I know I went through it fast because I want the video to be somewhat reasonable in length or people are not going to watch it, but I want to try to help you. You can go back, you can go through those 15 tips again. Once again, if you tried all of these 15 tips and you still have a problem, click the link in the description box, go to the PreSonus user forum and describe, post, you know, it's free to be there, create yourself an account. There's a section for things like this, and you can go in and put your problem, make a post, and I'm sure there'll be people out there that can help you. Also, if you're watching this video and there's even more things that you've personally tried that you know works on your system that wasn't part of my 15, please leave it in the comments below. So for people that are watching this video in the future, they can scroll down and maybe read about some things that you all tried that I didn't even think of or I have no experience with. Okay, this is going to be the helpful video that I'm going to send everybody to when they contact me about latency and audio artifacts in their audio. And then lastly, I guess I'll give you one more bonus tip. Bonus tip number 16 would be, if all else fails, you got one of two choices. You may want to look at, again, your computer, because you may have to invest in a computer. We'll talk about that in a second. But you can always uninstall your DAW and you can reinstall it. That may be another thing you can try as a last resort before you go out and spend the money on a computer. You may say, maybe there's something corrupt. Maybe there was a corrupt file somewhere. I never had this problem, and then all of a sudden this thing started. If you never had the problem with the computer that you're working on, and you were working on similar sessions in the past with similar amounts of plugins, similar VSTs, now all of a sudden this problem cropped up, there could be something that you downloaded inadvertently or something that a file just on your system has gotten corrupt, or a plugin has gotten corrupt, and that could be causing the problem. You can always just uninstall your DAW, reinstall your DAW, open up your song file again, and try that. If that doesn't work, and now you've been through, what, 16 different things that you tried, the last thing is you may want to start about a computer. You got to think about your computer. Now, again, whether you're buying Mac or PC really doesn't matter. I'm a devout Mac user, but I know lots of people that use PC. But regardless of the platform you use, I would tell you the specs need to be about the same. You need, if you're going to get a brand new computer, you may want to see if you can get up to an 8-core, or an i5 or an i7 processor. You want to spend as much money on the processor and on the RAM as you possibly can. Now, the good thing about RAM is pretty inexpensive. So if you're buying a PC, you could buy it with a minimal amount of RAM, put your money into the processor, and then you can always manually upgrade the RAM, probably cheaper than buying it from the manufacturer. But you want to get as much RAM into that machine as you can. I have 64 gigs of RAM in my machine. Again, RAM is pretty cheap. And I have an 8-core processor. But even if you have a 4-core, max out your RAM is probably the cheapest thing you can do to try to improve things. The other thing I would tell you to do, especially if you're buying a new computer, most computers today have internal SSD drives. Try to have a computer that has a solid state drive as opposed to the old mechanical drives. That is going to help speed up the process and allow you to process more things in a more efficient way. Okay. And if you do that, if you get the fastest processor you can get, and you get 16 gigs or even 30 or 20 or 30 gigs of RAM, and you get an SSD drive in there, you should be able to do 90% of what you want to do. Unless you're running huge sessions, you should be okay. If you have the foundation solid with good computer specs, fairly new computer, then go back and try these other 15 things on the list, and I would be willing to bet that 99% of you will be able to resolve or at least narrow down where your problem is. So I hope you found this video somewhat helpful. Sorry it's a little long-winded, but those are my 15 tips to how to resolve latency and/or audio artifacts, crackles, and pops in your Studio One session. And again, for Pro Tools, Cubase, any of the other DAWs as well. A lot of these things will apply. Click that like and subscribe button. Share this video with others. Go out to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Get your 5 free mixing training courses. It's my gift to you just for visiting Home Recording Made Easy. It's $110 free. Go there today. And also, if you want to learn the craft of mixing in a very non-technical way, great for beginners and intermediates so you can make professional sounding mixes in your home studio, check out what I have going on at mixingmadeeasy.net. Again, all the links are in the description box below. And until the next video, I've been Dave with homerecordingmadeeasy.com, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.